Welcome back to the subconscious classroom. You've traveled far tonight, past the aqueducts, beyond the olive groves and bathhouses, through the humming streets of marble and sweat. And now you're standing at the doors of a domus. Private Roman home, grand, gated, lavishly carved. The scent of oil lamps and roasted dormice seeps through the cracks of the doorframe. The guards don't greet you. They don't have to. You're expected, though not necessarily wanted. You have been invited to a Roman banquet, convivium, the kind of evening where reputations rise and crumble over honeyed wine and poisoned fruit, where food is not sustenance, it is theater, a performance of power. And the moment you step inside, your survival is no longer about hunger. It's about hierarchy. Let us begin. Part 1. Enter the feast like a strange. First, understand this. The Roman banquet was never just a meal. It was a ritual, a social weapon, a minefield of etiquette where one misstep, one spilled goblet, one misplaced laugh could exile you from a patron's favor or mark you as a fool. Banquets took place in the triclinium, the formal dining room. But this was no simple hall. It was a carefully constructed stage, named for the 3 reclining couches that framed the table in a U-shape. Guests did not sit. They lounged on their left sides, supported by embroidered cushions, so their right hands could remain free for eating, gesturing, or gripping a cup in strategic silence. Already, you don't quite belong. You sit too stiffly. You reach with the wrong hand. You speak when you should have nodded. And though the host smiles at you, the room knows. You're out of place, out of time. Your position in the triclinium matters more than anything on the table. The host reclines at the central couch, flanked by his favored guests. Politicians, poets, generals, social climbers. This isn't generosity. It's a signal. Your placement reflects your rank, and your rank can change before dessert. The far corner? That's for the poor cousin, the pensioned-off soldier, the merchant who showed up with the wrong shoes. Food and wine don't arrive equally. A prized guest might be served peacock breast with imported Indian pepper, while the man beside him, just a rung lower, receives boiled cabbage. No one comments. No one dares. But everyone sees. The first course is called gustatio, the appetizer. Eggs, olives, sea urchins, wine sweetened with honey and mulled with spices. There's murmured laughter as a platter of snails is passed around, their shells still steaming. You hesitate. That was mistake number 1. The host gestures for you to try them, and so you do, but your hand trembles. You spill the juices. Oil drips onto your sleeve. A slave silently replaces your napkin, but the woman across from you smiles just a little too long. You've been noticed. Music begins. A cithara strums softly in the background, accompanied by a flautist with eyes like stone. Slaves glide silently around the room, their eyes trained downward. One is no older than 15. She carries a tray of fish past you. Her eyes flicker upward, just once. You look too long. Mistake number 2. Your host is watching. Not because he cares about her, but because he's measuring your ability to pretend not to care. The second course, prima mensa, arrives with ceremony. This is the heart of the feast. Meats, game, sauces made with garum, fermented fish brine so pungent, it clings to your skin like smoke. There's pork shaped like wild boar. There's actual boar shaped like a mythological creature. Everything is excessive. Everything is symbolic. The pig's liver is passed only to the guest of honor. It is still warm. You receive chicken. But not just chicken. Chicken with sow's udder stuffed inside. boiled with date syrup and pine nuts. You try to smile. A man beside you boasts of his ancestors while picking eel bones from his teeth with a silver stylus. He has not once asked your name. That's mistake number 3. You thought the banquet was about conversation. There is a toast. The host lifts his cup. Not a large one, but wide and delicate. Falernian wine, almost 50 years old, worth more than your family's estate. The toasts matter. You are expected to echo praise, to flatter subtly, to toast others in turn. But you fumble the order. You toast someone too low, then someone too high, then forget to toast the host himself. No one scolds you, but a nearby senator begins whispering in Greek, and others listen. Your mistake is now part of the conversation. You are being consumed one word at a time. A slave enters carrying a tray of figs, glossy, perfect, aromatic. Poison has never smelled sweeter. In imperial circles, figs were often used to deliver a silent death, especially in the reigns of Tiberius and Nero. A fig could be soaked in hemlock, brushed with powdered stone, or injected with toxins so subtle the guest would fall asleep, then never wake. Tonight, the figs are just figs. Probably. You decline, and someone across the room smirks, as if to say, "Ah, so you know the old stories too." But in doing so, you've refused the host's hospitality, declined his generosity. Mistake number 4. The final course, secunda mensa, the dessert, is more performance than pleasure. There are candied fruits, jellied rose petals, and platters shaped like myth. A cake shaped like the severed head of Medusa, a melon filled with wine and herbs, sliced to reveal a dove hidden inside. The guests are laughing now, not at you, not yet, but near you, around you. A dwarf juggler is summoned. A lyre player sings something off-key. 2 guests argue over the meaning of a line from Virgil, each trying to flatter the host's taste while undermining the other. This is the real meal, the feast of ego, and you are starving. By the end of the evening, the air smells of oil, sweat, perfume, and burning laurel. The lamps have burned low. The food is gone, but the judgment lingers. Your ranking will be discussed tomorrow in the forum. Your fumbles will be exaggerated. Your name may never be spoken again. Because in ancient Rome, a banquet was not a place to eat. It was a place to perform. And you did not survive it. Part 2, you weren't invited for the food. The invitations never came on paper. There was no parchment scroll, no golden seal, no thoughtful engraving. No, if you were invited to a Roman banquet, you heard it by word of mouth. A whisper at the baths, a message from your client, a murmured line from a slave with good ears. And if you weren't invited, that was a message too. Banquets were not just meals, they were filters, a curated roll call of who mattered and who didn't. And the most brutal part? The host could invite you simply to humiliate you. In Roman society, hierarchy wasn't something that appeared only in temples or courtrooms. It lived in the dining room, and the man who controlled the table controlled the narrative. A patronus, a patron, might throw a banquet to reward his loyal clients, or to remind them of their place, or to make a rival look foolish by placing him near the door, far from the wine, beside a belching glutton or a wandering eye. The wealthy often used banquets to trap their guests in subtle warfare. There were no swords, just gestures, seating, timing, and food, so much food. But what was on your plate said more about your status than your toga ever could. The poet Juvenal, dripping with sarcasm, wrote bitterly about how Roman hosts fed their guests unequally. The honored man might receive fresh fish, the rest, spoiled scraps. The wine served to one man might be decades old, while the others were served vinegary swill. One man gets a flamingo tongue, another gets cabbage boiled in sheep urine. One guest dines on oysters. The man beside him is given mussel shells and told to chew slowly. And when you complain, the host laughs. It was a joke, of course. Behind this theater of privilege was an invisible army, the enslaved staff who made it all happen. A typical high-ranking Roman house might employ dozens of enslaved workers to orchestrate a single banquet. Some carved meat, others poured wine. One wiped guests' hands with perfumed cloths. Another held a mirror while guests picked food from their teeth. Some played music. Some watched the guests. Some watched each other. But they didn't speak, not unless spoken to. Their presence was expected, their absence a scandal, and their mistakes punished on the spot. Guests occasionally demanded a slave be whipped during the meal, just to add spectacle. Some hosts obliged, others smiled and made it part of the show. There were even enslaved boys whose sole job was to whisper the names of guests the host had forgotten. Imagine existing as a human cue card. And still, if a slave dropped a platter, he might be beaten publicly, or worse, drowned in a fish pond, as one emperor was rumored to have done, just to see the fish feast on failure. The food itself was rarely just food. It was a message, an experience, a warning. A dish might be sculpted into the shape of a goddess, only to be sliced apart and eaten. A platter of lamb might arrive wearing a false tongue, bleeding with spice sauce, hinting at betrayal. Roman cuisine wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed to shock. There was the infamous stuffed dormouse, a delicacy fattened in jars, skinned, and filled with pine nuts, honey, and pepper. There was garum, the fermented fish sauce that flavored nearly everything, an odor so potent it was said to mark your status from across the room. If you didn't know how to eat it without choking, you outed yourself immediately as provincial. And then there was the infamous jellyfish aspic, not for taste, not for texture, but because the sight of it wobbling on the plate made guests uneasy. That was the point. And sometimes food was a trap. Poison in ancient Rome was often served at the table, not to the masses but to rivals, to lovers, to heirs. The right mushroom could kill slowly. The wrong wine could silence someone by sunrise. Claudius, the emperor, was said to have been poisoned by his wife Agrippina, who served him a dish of mushrooms known as the food of the gods. He died vomiting. She smiled sweetly. Even Lucullus, famed for his banquets, was rumored to serve meals that doubled as tests of loyalty. You never knew which dish might carry a message, or a final dose. Then came the performances. A Roman banquet often included entertainment, but it wasn't always musical. It might be dancers, sword swallowers, dwarfs dressed as senators, or condemned criminals forced to act out scenes of death. Yes, sometimes actual death. A mythological drama might be performed in which a man playing Icarus falls from the ceiling and actually dies. That was part of the show, his death bought by the host. Other times, the host might unveil a gift, a rare animal, a cursed object, a scroll of scandalous poetry. something designed to stir the room into whispers, or laughter, or fear. These were not family dinners. These were calculated acts of political theater, more like dinner gladiators than dinner guests. And through all of this, you had to perform yourself. Every bite, every sip, every glance. Too eager, you're an upstart. Too restrained, you're cold. Too quiet, you have something to hide. Too loud, you've had too much wine. The banquet didn't just test your manners, tested your loyalty, your cleverness, your ability to sit through 3 hours of nonsense and still toast the man who made you eat burnt pigeon. By the time dessert arrived, you weren't full. You were exhausted. And yet, this was just one evening. For senators and social climbers, it was routine. Every meal was a performance, every room a trap. And you still hadn't figured out the rules. Because in ancient Rome, survival wasn't about bread. It was about spectacle. And you were always on stage. Part 3, the night did not end when the food did. The plates have been cleared. The dancers are gone. The slaves have gathered up the bones and bowls. But you are not dismissed. Because the Roman banquet doesn't end when the food stops coming. It ends when the masks fall off. The moment after the final fig, after the honey-soaked pastries, is when the most dangerous course begins, the wine. This is where true reputations are built and quietly destroyed. Romans did not drink to relax. They drank to perform. The symposium, borrowed and twisted from the Greeks, was the post-dinner ritual of structured inebriation. Guests drank not to lose control, but to show how well they could lose control. Each goblet raised after the meal came with a new risk: the loss of subtlety, the loss of secrets, the loss of friends. The wine itself was strong, too strong, so they diluted it, not because they wanted to drink less, but because drinking pure wine was seen as barbaric. Only the uncivilized drank it raw. So it was mixed, water and wine in a crater, a broad vessel stirred by slaves, its proportions decided by the host. 3 parts water, 1 part wine, or if the night was meant to escalate, 1-to-1. Sometimes, a guest would request stronger wine to impress others. That was a gamble, because in Rome, the wrong kind of boldness could smell like treason. After mixing, the wine was poured into skyphoi or calices, broad bowls with thin stems, and served in rounds. But these weren't free rounds. They followed a structure, a theme, a drinking order like a military rotation. The host or a chosen symposiarch would declare the topic: politics, love, death, poetry, philosophy. And each guest would be expected to speak, to toast, joke, reflect within that framework. A misstep could be fatal, literally or socially. Say something too clever and you might embarrass your host. Say something too dumb and you embarrass yourself. But say something true, and suddenly the room turns quiet. The Romans feared truth after wine. There was even a saying, in vino veritas, in wine truth. But truth was a dangerous gift, because the Roman world was built on masks, and the wine pulled them off. Many banquets included a game called the libatio, a ritual of offering drops of wine to the gods. It began as piety, but it often turned into a subtle contest of who was most favored by the divine. A guest might offer their libation to Bacchus, god of wine, another to Venus, goddess of seduction. One man early in the empire made a public libation to Nemesis, the goddess of revenge. He was dead within the month. And then there were the dream games. Some banquet hosts, especially those with mystical leanings, encouraged guests to stay overnight, not out of hospitality, but for ritual. You would be fed a final bite of opium poppy seed, or a sleep-inducing concoction of wine, honey, and herbs. You would sleep in the cubiculum, the guest chamber, and be instructed to remember your dreams. In the morning, a hired oneiromancer, a dream interpreter, would read your visions aloud to the table. It was never a private affair. You dreamed about water, you feared betrayal. You dreamed about falling, you were ripe for humiliation. You dreamed of fire, you desired someone in the room. Some guests were given fake interpretations on purpose. It was a way of measuring reaction, of watching discomfort, of drawing laughter from the dreamer's face. You were not expected to protest, not unless you wanted to seem guilty. Of course, if you refused to sleep in the house, that was suspicious too. What secrets did you fear being revealed? What loyalty did you hide? What dream might you be protecting? Even when the feast ended, the games continued. There were dice games played in whispers, betting on which slave would spill first, guessing how many grapes were in the host's mouth as he lounged on his elbow and smiled too long. One senator, it said, challenged another to a duel of digestion. They ate until one vomited or passed out. The winner earned a new villa. The loser earned infamy. But perhaps the strangest ritual came in the form of poetry. Guests were expected to recite something, improvised or prepared, before leaving. Some performed epigrams. Others, vulgar verses designed to make the crowd howl with wine-soaked laughter. But a poorly received poem could end a career, or a marriage, or a life. One guest, a minor official, performed a satire that rhymed the host's name with a pig's behind. He thought it was clever. The next morning, his land grant was revoked. His wife was summoned to court. His cousin disappeared. He had won the night and lost everything else. So when you imagine surviving a Roman banquet, remember this. It was not about food. It was not about music. It was not about entertainment. It was about control, watching who broke first, who slipped, who confessed, who begged. The food was a distraction. The wine was bait. And the audience was always listening. You weren't just fed. You were watched. You weren't just drunk. You were recorded. And when you left, if you left, your reputation left with you. Tarnished, lifted, or utterly devoured. Part 4, you were being laughed at, not with. You're still full, but not from food. You're full from fear, from judgment, from the sick weight of being seen too clearly too long. Because now you understand, the banquet wasn't a celebration. It was a test, a performance, a pit trap covered in figs and honey. You weren't fed, you were baited. You weren't hosted, you were watched. And when the laughter swelled across the couches, you thought you were part of it. But you weren't. You were its cause. In Roman culture, there was no greater fear than public ridicule. Not execution, not exile, not even poverty. Ridicule followed you longer than any sword. And nowhere was that fear more potent than at the dinner table. Because while the baths and forums might echo with debate, it was in the banquet, over boar meat and beetroot, that reputations were broken. The laughter at Roman banquets was sharp, it was targeted, and it was strategic. A well-placed laugh could elevate a joke. A mistimed one could end a friendship. And refusing to laugh at your host's humor? That was suicide. Even the philosopher Seneca wrote of laughter as a weapon, a tool that could be wielded by the powerful to destroy the dignity of others without ever drawing blood. To be laughed at in the triclinium was to be undressed socially, piece by piece. A host might tell a joke at your expense. "Oh, don't worry, friend. We saved you a cup of real wine this time. The vinegar was just for yesterday." Laughter, wide-eyed smiles. And you? You must smile too. Because to correct the host or show insult would mark you as ungrateful. Even when the joke was meant to degrade you, you had to play along. You had to show that you understood, that you were clever enough to endure the joke, but not bold enough to challenge it. These social tests didn't stop with laughter. They crept into gifts too. A host might send each guest home with a takeaway, a garland, a wine flask, a trinket. But those gifts were graded. One guest might receive a gold ring, another a clay oil lamp, and another, nothing. It was a quiet way of marking who mattered, who pleased, who was being phased out. To receive a lesser gift was to wake the next morning knowing your value had been assessed and reduced. Even the seating order could humiliate. Guests who spoke too much, or toasted too slowly, or laughed at the wrong joke might find themselves moved mid-banquet, repositioned to a lesser couch. And no one would say why. They would simply stop passing you the wine. That movement from one cushion to another could follow you for years. Because Roman memory was long, and so was Roman cruelty. Then there were the banquets of silence, a ritual used to freeze out unwanted guests. Everything would be normal, the lamps lit, the meat steaming, the entertainment ready. But your host, he would never speak to you. Not once. Not a greeting, not a toast, not a glance. And the others, they would follow suit. It was like dining in a ghost house, eating food passed by hands that never met your eyes. This wasn't neglect. It was precision. To be forgotten in the room where everyone was remembered. Banquets also carried long shadows. What you said, what you didn't say, might be remembered days later in the courts, in the Senate, or in the whispered halls of the emperor's court. A misused word in a wine-soaked anecdote might be repeated out of context. And in Rome, context was everything. A laugh could become a slander. A joke about Caesar's nose? A veiled critique of empire. A toast to Venus? A nod to forbidden love affairs. Your words, even when meant to amuse, became clues, threads, bait. Even philosophers weren't safe. Pliny the Younger once described a banquet where a man was invited specifically to be mocked for his poverty. He was seated at the far end, served stale bread, given wine that hadn't aged a week. And the host? He laughed, not cruelly but casually, as though the man were part of a play, as though he had agreed to be the joke. But he hadn't. There were rules for the way you laughed, too. You could not laugh too loudly, lest you seem crude. You could not remain silent, lest you seem sullen. You had to know when to chuckle, how much to show your teeth, when to sigh as though deeply amused. Even laughter had a script, and if you didn't follow it, you were the script. But perhaps the cruelest part of all, the host might still thank you. Smile, shake your hand, offer a kind word at the door. But the others, they'd already stopped speaking to you. And next time, there would be no next time. You could not survive a Roman banquet because it wasn't a meal. It was a mirror, and it showed you exactly how little they thought of you. Slowly, politely, with olives and applause. Part 5: When the banquet became the emperor's game. Most Roman banquets were games of status, politics, and performance. But in the palaces of emperors, they became something else entirely. Not meals, not rituals, not even performances. They became illusions. And once you stepped inside, you weren't just being tested. You were being toyed with, because the emperor's banquet didn't follow rules. It rewrote them. Take Elagabalus, crowned emperor at just 14, worshipper of strange gods, drifter of worlds, dreamer of power. He didn't host banquets. He hosted hallucinations. Guests would arrive to tables strewn with rose petals, not scattered but dropped from ceiling vents in gentle drifts. Perfume was sprayed from hidden pipes. The air shimmered with scent so thick it clung to your teeth. But the petals didn't stop falling. One banquet was said to end when guests suffocated beneath thousands of blossoms, soft, sweet, and utterly inescapable. A floral avalanche. The emperor's joke. His meals weren't about taste. They were about confusion. He served mock foods, stone fruit carved from marble, loaves made of wax, apples filled with mice. The real food looked fake. The fake food looked real. Guests would bite, chew, hesitate, glance. And the emperor would smile. He wore silks that changed mid-meal, perfumed his hair with myrrh, changed his guests' seating without telling them, just to watch them realize they were suddenly closer or further from favor. Sometimes he fed guests food made to look like human flesh, not to frighten them, just to watch them squirm. And once, he invited the same group of men to 10 banquets in a row. Each night, they were served nothing. Nero was no less theatrical. He built a rotating dining room, a great mechanical platform that slowly turned as the meal progressed, mimicking the movement of the heavens. Above the table, a ceiling panel that released flowers, snow, or perfumes, depending on the mood, or the emperor's whim. Nero didn't dine. He orchestrated. His guests were pawns, seated not for conversation, but for positioning. He watched who reached for what, who toasted him first, who hesitated before sipping wine, who flinched when a plate of roasted flamingo was brought forth with fanfare. He once had a man seated beside him served a cup of wine filled with live fireflies, their glow mistaken for enchantment, until one escaped and landed in the man's eye. But the food was rarely the threat. The invitation was. To be invited to dine with an emperor meant you were either in favor or being drawn into the spotlight for reasons you wouldn't understand until it was far too late. Caligula was known to serve dinner beside his horse. That was the least strange thing about the evening. He would poison a guest, then pretend to weep. He would serve entire meals in total silence, watching who cracked first. He would have men summoned mid-meal to be arrested. Once, he ordered a guest's execution, then insisted the man eat dessert first. Banquets were not escapes. They were baited stages. One emperor filled his garden with chained wild animals, panthers, bears, apes, and loosed them mid-meal, laughing as senators leapt over tables in terror. Another hired actors to act out the guests' own deaths, imagined futures where they were executed for treason, played for laughs. It wasn't meant to be threatening. It was meant to be hilarious. Even Commodus, gladiator emperor and son of Marcus Aurelius, turned his banquets into arenas. He would dress as Hercules. Guests were expected to address him as divine. He would eat boar meat by the handful, roast ostrich eggs, drink wine from skulls, and smile. Then he'd offer you a goblet and watch, just in case you hesitated. He once served a roasted human hand, passed off as monkey. The guest who ate it was promoted. The guest who declined was exiled. But perhaps the strangest part? These evenings were remembered fondly by some. Poets wrote verses about the softness of the petals, the music in the wine, the scent of heaven rising from the plates. Senators laughed after surviving, because survival at the emperor's table wasn't just about cleverness or etiquette. It was about luck. One slip, one expression, one sigh, and you might be tomorrow's entertainment. You could not survive a banquet thrown by a Roman emperor, because you weren't there to eat. You were there to be unmade. Bit by bit, laugh by laugh, plate by plate. Part 6, the air itself was watching you. By now, you've survived 5 courses of humiliation, manipulation, and spectacle. But even if no one poisoned your wine, even if no one rearranged the seating to exile you in silence, even if the emperor didn't release a leopard beneath the table, you'd still be drowning. Because the Roman banquet wasn't just something you ate. It was something you breathed. The walls whispered, the ceilings shimmered, the smells didn't stay politely on the plates. In a Roman triclinium, even the air conspired against you. Banquets were full-body experiences, designed to overwhelm, impress, disorient, seduce, and subdue. And the closer you were to power, the more your senses were manipulated. Let's begin with the room itself. The triclinium was built to enclose you, not warmly, but richly. Walls painted with myth and theater. Venus lounging in a seashell, Bacchus vomiting grapes, Persephone weeping behind pomegranate bars. These weren't just pretty pictures. They were reminders of what happened to those who pleased the gods and what happened to those who didn't. Even the ceilings were a trap. Hidden mechanisms might release rosewater mist, snow made from crushed marble dust, or worse, rotten petals dropped for dramatic effect. The floor beneath your couch, it might be inlaid with mosaic patterns that tricked the eye. Seashells, skeletons, frogs devouring snakes, fish eating men. A banquet was not meant to soothe you. It was meant to keep you slightly off balance every second. Now imagine the smells. Not a single smell, but layers, competing, colliding. Start with the garum, the fermented fish sauce that clung to almost every savory course. Sharp, salty, ancient. It was so pungent that factories producing it were often kept far outside the city. But on the banquet table, it was a badge of wealth. Then add the roasted meats, boar basted with wine, goose stuffed with figs, dormice drenched in poppy milk. The honeyed desserts, the pine resin on the wine jugs, the sweat of a dozen reclining men in summer wool, the myrrh rubbed into the host's elbows, the candle smoke wafting above your head, the perfume poured over a guest's feet by a smiling servant. Each dish was announced by scent before it reached your mouth. And the mixture? Sweet and sour, holy and rotting, temptation laced with decay. The sounds followed you too. Not music alone, but rhythm. A cithara strummed in minor chords. A flute wavered off-key. A double-reed pipe moaned somewhere from behind a curtain. Slaves spoke in murmurs. Dishes clinked. Dogs barked just beyond the garden wall. The rustle of silk. The lap of wine. the low laugh of a guest who wasn't laughing at the joke, but at you. Even silence had its own weight, came between courses thick and expectant. If you broke it, eyes turned. If you didn't, you might fade into it completely. And what of touch? You were expected to eat with your fingers. You dipped them in warm water between courses, dried them on embroidered cloth, then reached, gracefully, for the next bite. But the textures weren't always friendly. Some dishes were designed to disgust: grit from fish bones, jelly from calves' feet, boiled sow's udders, gizzards in honey, livers shaved to look like fruit, cheeks, tongues, testicles. Anything tender was fair game. You could not wince. You could not gag. To show distaste was to reveal weakness. The food clung to your fingers. The honey dried in your beard. The oils slicked your sleeves. You were being asked to perform pleasure, no matter how much your body resisted. Even temperature was used to unsettle. In winter, the rooms were overheated, braziers lit beneath the couches, pushing smoke up into your lungs. In summer, you might recline beneath open skylights, where cold water trickled through channels in the walls, just enough to raise goosebumps on your arms and make your wine congeal in the cup. The environment never adapted to you. You adapted to it. And if you failed, if you wiped your hands on the wrong fabric, if you coughed on a fig, flinched at the eel's eyes, smelled something too strongly and wrinkled your nose, then you had broken the illusion. You had revealed yourself. And that was the greatest failure of all. Because Roman banquets weren't simply meals. They were arenas of restraint. A place where your ability to remain composed under heat, under scent, under scrutiny proved whether you belonged. To eat at a Roman table was to suppress every impulse. To train your hands, choke your throat, smother your nose. To laugh when the food tasted of salt and decay. To nod when the emperor tossed rose petals in your wine. To swallow not just the food, but the shame. You could not survive a Roman banquet. Not because the food was strange, not because the rules were cruel, but because even the very air around you had turned against you. And in Rome, you had to smile through it all. Part 7, the feast that never ended. The candles have gone out. The laughter has faded. The doors of the domus are shut. But the banquet is still with you. Because no one ever really left a Roman feast unchanged. It wasn't just food. It was memory, ritual,
surveillance,
suspicion, performance. And the strange truth is this: the banquet lasted longer than the meal, longer than the night, longer than the empire itself. Because once you dined in ancient Rome, Rome never stopped dining on you. Survivors of the banquet wrote about it, some bitterly, some longingly, but never without tension. The poet Horace, a master of subtle flattery and coded disdain, once wrote of a dinner where the wine was too sour, the laughter too loud, the compliments too false. He was expected to be grateful. He wrote the poem anyway. Martial, famous for his epigrams, described hosts who invited poor clients just to publicly mock their cutlery, who served stale bread and then asked how it tasted. And yet he kept going back. Because to not attend was worse than any insult. The banquet was a trap you willingly returned to, again and again. The rituals once endured became part of you. You remembered which hand to eat with, when to speak, when to pretend not to hear the insult. You remembered the smell of the lamb's blood steaming beneath rosemary. You remembered the dream you were told meant betrayal. You remembered the silence after you told your joke, and no one laughed. You remembered the figs. You never forgot the figs. Banquets weren't just events. They were tools of social control. They served no single master. The patrician used them to assert dominance. The client used them to beg favor. The poet used them to sharpen his tongue. The emperor used them to break the world apart with laughter. And the people, they sat, they smiled, they swallowed. They became players in a story that had nothing to do with food. Even in death, the banquet followed you. Romans were buried with images of feasts carved into their tombs. Reclining figures, goblets raised. Eternal suppers where the wine never stopped flowing and the host was always kind. It was a fantasy, a lie told in stone. But it was the only banquet you could survive. And still, the empire changed. The tables fell. The villas collapsed. The garum factories rotted at the edge of forgotten ports. But the banquet, the idea of the banquet, survived. It lives in the way we arrange a table, in who we choose to invite, in what we withhold from those we no longer wish to see, in the uneasy silence between courses, in the strange pressure to perform over food, to laugh when the wine burns, to pretend we're full when we're starving for something else entirely. So no, you could not survive a banquet in ancient Rome, because no one really did. They endured it. They masked themselves. They played their part. And when it was over, they went home and prayed they hadn't said too much, or too little, or too soon. And now, as the candles flicker out in your imagination, and the marble floors cool beneath ancient dust, let your breath settle. Let the air grow still. And know that somewhere across 2,000 years, the table is still set. The wine is still warm. And the host is still watching.